Okay, we're live. Welcome, everybody. We are team All on the Line, North Carolina. My name is Bri.
And my name is Lekha, and this is our recap of sort of the final days of the North Carolina redistricting process, Finger Counties edition.
I'll be okay if I never hear the phrase finger counties again, but
well, you're going to hear it some more with
heard it a lot.
15-20 minutes.
So we're here because the North Carolina legislature passed the final floor votes today on the new congressional and legislative maps. I guess one of them had already passed, but they're all now three have become law because we don't.
Yeah, they're basically they have to be formally enrolled, but they're basically law now because our governor does not have the veto over redistricting.
Right. So we are just going to kind of catch folks up on the last, I don't know what time is anymore, but the last, 4 or 5 days where they were making their way through committees and debates and the floor votes, and just make sure that everyone knows kind of what that looked like, and is up to speed. So Lekha, why don't you first kind of just give us an overview of what it looks like when the maps finally start making their way, getting votes in committee, votes on the floor.
Yeah, so in North Carolina, redistricting maps and redistricting bills, which is basically just you put the redistricting maps in bill form, are treated pretty much like any other bill for the most part. And so they go through the same process where they go to a committee, either in the Senate or in the House, they pass through that committee, they go to the floor of that House, they pass through there, then they go to they go to the other House. So things from House go to the Senate and vice versa. They go to the appropriate committee in the other House, and then they go to the floor of the other House, and that, and then that's sort of the end. So basically what we saw Republican maps being brought forward in these House and Senate redistricting committees. So in the Senate redistricting committee, that's where the Republican congressional maps came from. They didn't actually officially put together any congressional maps in the House. And then obviously the Senate map, and then the House committee had the House map. And it's sort of tradition in North Carolina that each House gets to kind of handle their own maps and get sort of deference on their own maps. And so basically, usually when it comes to state legislative maps, at least, whatever passes out of the previous House, there's just not a lot of debate about it because it's sort of considered to be the other House's prerogative.
Right. And I will point out that House chair of the redistricting committee, Dustin Hall, made sure to point out that he also drew a very similar congressional map. It officially started in the Senate.
Yeah, what's funny though about that is that the only House map the only congressional map that I saw him draw was actually really different from the one that finally passed from the Senate, even though he said it was the same.
He did several times.
But I certainly did not see him draw a congressional map that was the same as the one in the Senate. Maybe he did at some point that I wasn't watching, but the one that I saw him working on was not the same.
Interesting. And I will say, we should also just mention that you watched pretty much the entirety of the map drawing over the past few weeks.
I'd say probably, this week and a little bit of last week, I kind of slowed down and didn't see absolutely everything, but the heart of the map drawing, I'd say I watched pretty much all of it.
Thank you for your service.
Well, I am a big weirdo because I actually enjoy that stuff, but
yeah. Well, we enjoyed it on Twitter. Okay, so the kind of how it works is they come in when they're ready to present the map to the full body, either in the committee or on the floor, and the person who is, was in charge of it, talks through the map and kind of introduces it to folks, and then they debate and then they vote. So how did that, go when how did the Republicans talk about the maps that they drew?
Yeah, it was really interesting because they were really, really fixated on talking about what they saw as the good aspects of their maps, but it was often very deceptive. So, for instance, when they were talking about the congressional map, they would say, okay, well, this congressional map only splits 11 counties. So when you say only splits 11 counties, that just says how many counties have some split in them. It doesn't say how many splits there are total. And it doesn't really explain why counties that are like Mecklenburg and Wake and Guilford that don't need to be split multiple times were split multiple times in a map. So like they're really kind of using that language to obscure what's actually going on. I think the other thing that people felt was really deceptive is they used public comments to say like, oh, this person wanted this. So for instance, there were people in the Sandhills who said like, we wanted, Sandhills district that includes these 6 counties or something. And then they would say, and then like, the Republicans would be like, we drew Sandhills district that includes these 3 counties, and say that that was what that person wanted when they were leaving out like half of the counties that person had asked for. And they were actually really splitting up that whole area that person had actually wanted a district in. They took a lot of comments out of context. So a lot of people were commenting on things in state legislative maps, like state legislative districts are a lot smaller, right? So someone might say, I know one of our volunteers, Martha, had said like, oh, well, I think that High Point should be kept whole in state legislative maps. And then they would take that and say like, oh, well, High Point is being kept whole in the congressional maps. And so obviously this is what she wanted. And what she really had said about the congressional maps was that she doesn't want High Point and Greensboro and Winston-Salem to be split up, which they are. So they were just basically being very, very deceptive, kind of misusing people's comments, taking them out of context, being really deceptive about how they were using those comments, and also being really deceptive about how they were using different, measures that they were talking about their counties. So like, for instance, there was this one instance where like, I know Ralph Hayes was like, well, we chose this county grouping for reasons. And one of the, districts in this is the most compact district in the whole map. Not saying that because you chose that county grouping, the other district that map is like one of the least compact districts, so just playing all these kind of word games and just being very, very deceptive.
And I also noticed that they were, it certainly seemed like they were, reading from a script, which is sort of understandable because when they were going over the maps, because it's like a long, explanation that they have to give, but then they were very carefully choosing their words as they were talking about the maps. Very scripted.
Yeah, so all the experts that have looked at these maps have said there's no way you get maps that look like this without considering partisan information in some way. It's just not possible to do this using only nonpartisan criteria and get these kinds of outcomes. But they were very careful about not indicating that at all, which a lot of the time meant that they like just were not answering questions at all. So, someone would say, okay, well, like, why did you split Wake County 3 ways? And then they would be like, well, Wake County is really big. Not acknowledging that, like, yes, Wake County is very large. It still only has to be split once. So yeah, like just because they really weren't able to talk about what was really going on and why they were really doing what they were doing. A lot of the times when Democrats especially would ask questions with the map, the answers would be just like really mismatched or not make sense because they only have so much to work with and it's not the stuff that they actually were thinking about.
Yeah. Okay. And I also want to go back and just point out for folks that if you're kind of curious about those comments that they were pulling out of context, there is a story in NC Policy Watch that was written by Lynn Bonner. I think it was published today, November 4th, or yesterday, November 3rd, that talked to some of the people who were misquoted and got some reaction from them. So encourage folks to check that out if they're interested in sort of the ways that the Republicans are trying to spin the public comments and cherry pick them.
Which is just like amazing to me because if anyone at all watched any of the public comments that we had last week, literally like 99% of people were like, these maps are awful. We hate them. Like do better. And somehow they were like able to like turn that into like, people really liked them.
And they were also like, they kept talking about these public comments that asked for the finger counties to be kept together.
Yeah,
which,
what the hell is up with the finger counties? Like, okay, like, yes, people who live in like Pascatank and Perkins, like, I understand
fair.
there's an interest for them to be kept together.
Fair.
But when someone is like, what happened today, right? So Senator Chaudhry offered a congressional map today on the floor. And he was like, this map, doesn't split VTDs as much. It keeps more municipalities together. Like, it's much better. It doesn't split, Wake and Mac and Guilford more times than they need to. It keeps all these communities. So basically, just like going through, it's like it has great compactness scores that are better than the so he goes through all these things. And then Destin Hall was like, well, you shouldn't vote for this map because it splits up the finger counties. And I was like, okay, but like, what about all of the other things? And like, yes, maybe they're like, those people have an interest in being together, but also like, so the people in Guilford, so the people in Forsyth, so the people like in, in Mecklenburg, like the finger counties became with like a weird like fixation about like,
yeah, we're going to ignore all of the comments from people in Guilford County, in Mecklenburg County, in Forsyth, and all of these other places.
I think Representative Harrison even said, she was like, okay, like you're saying this thing about the finger counties, but like a ton of people from my area said that they wanted their community, like they wanted the triad cities to be kept together. Like, why is this random comment you're citing about the finger counties like a billion times more important than all of these hundreds of people from my area?
Well, that gets to another kind of point that I think the Democrats raised, and we can maybe talk a little bit about. They had criteria. They talked about, they were very proud of their criteria, their traditional criteria, and they weren't going to look at partisanship, and they weren't going to look at race, and they said that a lot of times. But what is some of the criteria? But they were. What came up a lot was that they never, even when the criteria was being debated, there was a question about how are you going to prioritize the criteria? So how are you going to make sure that we know which criteria you're going to prioritize when they're in tension with each other? And they basically said, we're not. And then we saw when they were, sharing their maps that they chose whatever worked for them in that moment.
Yeah, they would basically pick and choose and be like, well, here I'm going to talk about how few VTDs are split. And here I'm going to talk about how few municipalities are split. So like we had like, I think in the Senate map, Fayetteville is split in the Senate map because it's pretty large and it needs to be split. But they also split the town of Hope Mills, which doesn't seem necessary. It's not that big. And when then they were asked like, okay, well, why did you split Hope Mills? They were like, well, we didn't split very many VTDs. And like the answers just like wouldn't line up with the questions. But then when they would get to somewhere like Wake and, maybe Democrats would propose an amendment, and then they would be like, well, this splits, more municipalities or something like that. It's like, okay, well, you care about splitting municipalities now, but you didn't care about it in Fayetteville. And there's no clear reason why. Like, they created the situation. So not only were the criteria super vague, which I feel like I've talked about a ton, because to me, it's like nuts how vague they were and how little they actually were constrained by them. But also by not ordering them, they create the situation where like they can just come up with an explanation for anything because there's no priority. So they'd be like, well, cities are really important here, but cities aren't important here. VTDs are important here. Or like, VTDs aren't important here, compactness is important here. And just like basically manipulating the criteria to do basically whatever you want.
Yes. Okay. They were very proud of the criteria that they drew to make it possible for them to do whatever they wanted.
Yeah, I mean, it's wild. Like, I guess I know why they're doing it, but I'm like, y'all, just like, we know, don't stop trying to act like you actually have any principles here.
Yeah. It was not a principled discussion that I observed in the committees or on the floor. So there were several kind of major concerns that were raised over and over again in the various debates by Democrats. Can you talk about what sort of the overarching concerns were that were brought out?
Yeah, so one that I definitely want to talk about is sort of how the Northeast of the state was dealt with and how Democrats felt that related to Republicans neglecting to follow the Voting Rights Act. So, and I will try to share my screen because I have an illustration that is also like a meme I made. And then I'm a little bit embarrassed because I'm like, wow, how dorky was I to make a meme like this? But this is what I have.
I mean, it tracks.
Yeah, you know me. Anyway, so if you look at this, you can see these are two options for county groupings in the state Senate maps. And so like on the left, you have the one that a lot of Democrats in the Senate proposed an amendment to use this county grouping. And then on the right, you have the one that Republicans proposed. And so basically what happened was Republicans got up and they were like, okay, well, we chose this grouping because the blue grouping is super compact. As you can see that like that also means that the pink grouping is super non-compact. And then they said something about like media markets, like we're doing this by media markets, which also was weird because then someone brought up like, well, Warren County is in the Raleigh media market and Carteret County is in the like Greenville media market. So like that still doesn't really do anything for you. They just like said a bunch of weird stuff about like why this was great. And, you know, besides the obvious thing of like, you know, people who live next to the Virginia border being in the same district with people who live at Emerald Isle, like, which is ridiculous. You know, it'd take 4 hours to drive from one to the other. You can't even drive straight through that district. You'd have to go out and like go through like Greenville or something. But the other point that really got brought up by legislators, and I think particularly Senator Blue in the Senate committee, was that when you choose this county grouping on the right, what you do is you're breaking up what he said was like a historical Voting Rights Act district. So there are, you know, he said there are rural Black communities that have lived in this, you know, area in sort of like Martin, Bertie, Halifax kind of area for like a very long time. And that in the past, this was always considered to be a Voting Rights Act district, so a district where you know, Black voters could elect a candidate of their choice, and it was sort of drawn that way. And by choosing this other grouping, you're totally breaking that up and really reducing the amount of, and kind of breaking up and splitting up and cracking the amount of Black voters in that area between two different districts. And what Senator Blue was saying was that, you know, the law in North Carolina says that you have to draw any voting rights districts before you draw any other districts. And he also said that, you know, the precedent is that to figure out whether or not you can dismantle a pre-existing Voting Rights Act district or draw a new one, you have to do certain kinds of studies about whether or not there's racially polarized voting, you know, how many people in that minority are there in that minority community, do they vote cohesively? Like there's just like a lot of analysis that you need to do that he was talking about, you know, that you need to do before you can disrupt and dismantle what, you know, he says was like a VRA district. And so, you know, so he was basically making this point, and I think he was trying to contradict what a lot of the Republican legislators were saying, was that, well, in this previous case, I think they were referring to Covington, they were saying that there was a showing that there was no racially polarized voting in North Carolina. And basically what Blue said that is an incorrect interpretation. He was saying that what actually happened in that case was that Republican legislators at the time packed Black voters into as few districts as possible, right? So like had lots and lots of districts where they were packing Black voters in places that had not previously been sort of Voting Rights Act, like Section 5, like prevalence, places where they were looking for racially polarized voting. So places like Wake County and Durham, which like really haven't had racially polarized voting in the past. And what Blue said was that the court wasn't saying that anything about whether or not there's racially polarized voting or Voting Rights Act districts can or can't be drawn. The court was just saying, according to Blue, that like you can't just pack a bunch of Black voters for no reason, having done no analysis and having not shown that it's necessary or that it's meaningful. And so that was a really interesting part of the discussion, I think, and especially because, like, as we know, Southern Coalition for Social Justice has already filed a lawsuit about these maps that rests on that idea that by not conducting a racially polarized voting analysis, Republicans actually just from the get-go violated North Carolina law around redistricting, because previous state Supreme Court case law says that you have to draw Voting Rights Act districts first, and to draw Voting Rights Act districts, federal precedent says that you have to do a certain kind of analysis. So that was a really interesting aspect. Now I'll stop sharing now, but so that was a really big thing that I think is really interesting because we're already seeing litigation around that issue. And, as far as I could tell, Republicans did not have very good answers for those questions either. It kind of got to the point where like they didn't really, like, I will say that like Senator Blue went like on this really long speech that must have taken like at least half an hour, and I like documented all of it. To me, it was super, super interesting because he walked through all of this like in a very thorough way. And if you want to go look, I did tweet about it. But like at that point, like, I don't think Republicans even said anything back to everything that he was saying, because they like, Senator Blue is like a smart person who like knows this stuff, and like they don't, or like they just don't have anything substantial to say about it.
They were just like finger counties.
Yeah, I mean, like, yeah, finger counties.
Yeah, that was what I noticed is they just sort of didn't respond. They don't really have an answer for that. So definitely in the Senate map, there are the issues in the Northeast with that were raised by Democrats in the debates on these maps. What were some of the other things that they brought up?
So, I mean, some obvious stuff that happened was that Democrats did not propose any full state legislative maps, but they proposed a lot of clusters. So, if you have been following redistricting at all, you know that in our state legislative maps, we have this thing called county clusters. I think it's a very terrible idea. That's ridiculous and shouldn't happen. But, North Carolina is ridiculous all the time, so why not? But anyway, county groupings like group counties together, and then the districts are drawn within those groupings. And so what Democrats tended to do was to propose particular county groupings that could, as an amendment, replace the ones that Republicans had drawn. And it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. We just saw like really weird deflection. So a Democrat would say like, I drew this kind of grouping in Wake County, and it splits the same number of municipalities, but it splits no VTDs or something like that, splits no precincts. And the compactness measure is better by a whole 10% than like than yours or something like that. And then Republicans would be like, well, we have this random problem with it. So like, I think one was saying that like, well, it splits too many municipalities. And so then Democrats would come back and be like, okay, well, we have this other amendment, which like splits a couple more VTDs, but now doesn't split municipalities because that seems to be what you care about here. And Republicans would just be like, no. And also what happened a lot, especially on the floor, was that Democrats' amendments were just getting tabled like right away. So like someone would propose an amendment, they'd be like, this is what the amendment is. It's proposed for this county grouping. It like, it's more compact. It splits less VTDs. It splits like, and whatever, they would talk about it. And then Republicans would immediately be like, we're tabling that. Like, and so when you table something, basically when you move to table something, you go straight to a vote. There's no debate on it. And Republicans are in the majority, so they vote to table something. So they basically prevented any substantive debate on any of these amendments, which to me is just like, that they are like, why would you do that if you thought that your map was actually better? If your map was actually better, then you would be like, okay, debate this amendment. I don't care because my map is still better. Like you can't find a way that might, like, but
willing to make an actual argument for your map.
yeah, like they, they didn't want to even discuss it, which just tells you, that they know that like they know what they're doing. They know how manipulative they're being. They know that their map actually isn't good according to like literally anyone.
So what about on the congressional side? There were several, I know there was some good discussion about, the number of the Republicans were very proud that they only split 11 counties. But then the Democrats brought up, like which counties were split and how many times and how that kind of factored into that. And also just generally, from the public comments that we heard, the counties that were being split, what was some of the arguments that were made around that or the discussion around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's similar to what we brought up before. So, in the congressional map that Republicans drew, Guilford County is split 3 times. Most of it, and the city of Greensboro is also split there. It's split it's something like 60% of it's in one district and 20% of it's in another district and 20% of it's, or 15% of it somewhere else, or just kind of ridiculous. But like the heart of Greensboro is taken out and paired with a bunch of mountain counties and basically is now going to be in Virginia Fox's district, which she lives in Watauga County. So that tells you something about what the kind of map they were drawing. And so obviously there were a number of legislators who were from that area who were like, this doesn't make any sense. No one in this area wants this. It's not necessary for numbers reasons because all of Guilford County could fit in a single congressional district. Plus you could add a bunch of Winston-Salem or something because the population is just not that large. You don't need to split it up that much.
You don't need to split it at all.
Yeah, you don't need to split Guilford County at all.
Unlike Wake and Meck, which you have to split at least, you have to split once and they split.
Yeah, but Guilford County is small enough that all of Guilford County could fit into a single congressional district along with some of Winston-Salem.
And the other choice that they made that I thought was interesting that was brought up was how they chose which people to double bunk, and they basically drew the current rep, Kathy Manning, into the same district as they very carefully. Can you talk a little bit about what that looked like drawing Virginia?
Yeah, so Guilford County is a square, right? And so basically the top of Guilford County is cut out this cup that goes around part of Guilford. And then on either side are split down in the middle, one half of the side of the cup goes this way and the other half goes this way. And this half goes with part of Southern Wake County and also part of Davidson County and part Randolph County or something, just whatever was stuck in the middle that Republicans couldn't get rid of. To be
clear, people in Greensboro are going to be in the same district as people in Southern Wake County.
People in Greensboro are going to be the same district as people in Holly Springs are going to be in the same district as people who live in Asheboro, where the zoo is. Just wildness. Yeah, so just ridiculous. There's no reason for that. No one asked for that. No one wanted it. It was actually really interesting because during the public hearings last week, there was only, I think, one speaker from Caldwell County, but it was this woman who's the head of the Republican Women of Caldwell County or something like that. And she was like, I'm a Republican. I live here. I don't want to be in the same district as people from Greensboro. That doesn't make sense to me. I don't want that. But of course, they don't care. They don't even care what their own people think either.
So they intentionally put Fox and Manning in the same district when it would have, certainly made more visual sense just to have Fox be in the same district with the mountains where Watauga is, the rest of Watauga.
Yeah.
Then she would have been.
There's also this other thing where basically they drew this district and then, obviously Greensboro has quite a bit of population. So if you take that and you if you're trying to take that and get all the way to Virginia Fox, you're picking up, Greensboro is already large. You're picking up a bunch of population to try to even get there because it's she lives quite far away. And so what eventually happened was to even out population, they had to put this little finger going into Watauga County that only took where Virginia Fox outlived, and the rest of Watauga County went into Cawthorn's district. And like, it's just so laughable because it's so unnecessary. You know, when they were like, well, okay, why did you do this? And they were just like, well, there was too much population. It's like, the reason there was too much population is because you put green sparrow in there.
The fox finger. Okay. We've got
Oh,
the
that
finger
sounds really
scheme.
gross. Let's not do that. I feel like the finger counties is bad enough, but like, I don't.
Yeah, it's not, none of it's good. None of it's good. Okay. So, and then, you know, the response when folks brought up these issues with splitting, you know, when they were not, Republicans were not consistent in how they applied criteria. When that was brought up, you know, they made choices that were, you know, in violation of the Voting Rights Amendment. What was just the general kind of response from Republicans? Did they have good answers? What did that look like?
Yeah, not really. I mean, most of the time they just would not actually answer the question. So like, you know, someone would say like, okay, well, why did you split up Guilford this many times? Or why did you split up Myth Lake this many times? They'd be like, well, we only split 11 counties, which is like a non sequitur. Like, that's not answering the question. You know, or they'd be like, well, you know, like Mecklenburg is really large. Well, it's like, yeah, it's large, not so large you have to split it 3 times. You know, so just like really just not answering the question most of the time, you know, completely silent because they don't have a good answer, you know. There's no, it's just like, it's the finger counties thing, right? Where you're like, hey, I have this map. It's better in compactness in your map. It splits us municipalities in your map. It splits us VTDs in your map. Like, it doesn't double bunk, like it does all these things that are better by any measure and the criteria you set up in your map. And like, you literally have Justin Hall there being like, but the finger counties, because like he doesn't have anything else. He has the finger counties and that's it. He has nothing else.
Yeah.
Anyway,
except the map that he wants to have, which it seems like the whole point was to you know, have the map that they wanted to draw, and then you know, come up with the explanations after the fact. And you know, when they don't, they just repeat the talking points about you know, the most transparent process, historic, unprecedented levels of transparency.
oh my gosh, yeah. I mean, I got listening to Dustin Hall talk about how awesome he is, like literally 5 times in the past 5 days. Like every time he would present the map, he'd be like, this is the most historic, most transparent map process ever. And I did such a good job. And my map is so great. And it does all these good things. And like the finger counties are there and it's awesome. And I just think I was so great. And then he would also be like, and I'm so disappointed in the Democrats for not like, you know, drawing maps that I wouldn't have paid attention to anyway. I'm just so mad about that. And oh my God, you know, and then like people would ask him questions about his map. I remember this happened in committee, you know, Democrats would be like, okay, looks like you split this precinct 3 ways. Like, why did you do that? And he'd be like, how am I supposed to know why I did that? You know, he'd be like, I don't have it in front of me. You just asked me this question suddenly. Am I supposed to know things about how I drew the map? No. Like, it was amazing how angry he was getting about people asking questions about the map that he spent the last 3 weeks drawing.
Yes. Well, it's over. The process is over for now. It is, like we said, the maps have passed, and there's already been a lawsuit. What else? You know, what can folks expect? What kind of comes next for us anyway?
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. There is this lawsuit that Southern Coalition for Social Justice has filed. It looks really interesting. I'm really interested to see what happens with that, where that goes. And you know, it's North Carolina. Like, I don't think that's the end by any means. And you know, I think for us right now, it's sort of a moment to, you know, if litigation like this, you know, is going on, if the SCSJ case gets taken up and successful, that's like really a moment to start raising awareness about the problems with these maps and what's going on, because you know, public sentiment can be really consequential when there are cases like that.
And also just for, I think, you know, for general sort of like public education about this. I mean, that was something we heard a lot in the comments even, was, you know, people wanted more education, more opportunities to engage. And this is a moment now that these maps have passed to like get them in front of people and make sure folks understand what's happening and the impacts and why this process is so important, because, you know, it's gonna happen again. This process will happen, you know, certainly in 2031, if not before. And this is an opportunity to make sure that, you know, more people are paying attention.
Well, yeah, and I mean, if the SCSJ case is successful, we could very well see maps being redrawn next year.
Right.
We'd be going through this all again. And so all of the people who have spent all the time that they have spent, you know, we've been lucky to work with a ton of people across the state who've spent their time putting together comments and doing really effective advocacy. And they'll be called upon again if something like that happens. And maybe sooner than they think.
Yep. Okay, well, we will keep everyone posted as things move forward, you know, with that, whatever happens with these maps. And if there are opportunities, you know, to engage, we'll definitely be here for that, and just trying to make sure that people are able to understand what's going on and not have to watch, you know, 30 bajillion hours of map drawing, because we'll do that for you and just give you a
we do that.
probably slightly too long, but 30-minute Facebook Live
for you.
Well, thanks, Lekha, for recapping that whole, you know, I think it was a good, little longer maybe than we meant to go, but, you know, you boiled down 5 days of debate into, you know, a cool 40 minutes.
And thanks to Bri for shepherding me through it, because my brain is super fried at the moment. Like, if anyone saw my last Twitter thread, it was like real wild because I just could not take it anymore.
Yeah, it gets a little loose there at the end where we're just there's a lot of head exploding emojis. Okay, well, that's it for this Facebook Live. Keep an eye on the space, and we'll come back as soon as we've got you know meeting next week.
Yes, we are planning to have a volunteer meeting next week so that we can debrief everyone on everything that happened, and also talk about what is coming.
Advocacy coming up and all that. And we'll post that on the Facebook page and Twitter and everything. We haven't picked a time yet, but we'll get that up as soon as possible. All right.
All right.
Good, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.